Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different things going on in fall camp. There are definitely some injury concerns down there in Gainesville right now with DJ Lagway. There's quite a few quarterback battles to watch. Ohio State seems to be the one that's taking the cake, but I think there's a couple more around the country that we can get to on Friday that definitely will be interesting to watch as we get closer to the season. But now we got to talk about some questions. As we head into 2025, there's quite a few things that I want to know, and there's quite a few questions that I don't think anyone will really have an answer to until the season gets going, but I'm more than happy to speculate here for a little bit. And let's go ahead and jump into this. Let's talk about all of the major questions as we head into 2025. The biggest one, and the one that everyone's trying to figure out right about now, is who is this year's Indiana? Who is the team that might benefit from a little bit easier of a schedule? Not to say they're a bad team by any means, just to say that their schedule might set up very nicely for them, and then you go off and you make a CFP for the first time. Maybe you make some noise once you're there. But I'm going to go conference by conference, just give you one team to watch per conference. In the SEC, it's Missouri, and it's without question Missouri. Missouri is a team that has a schedule that sets up about as well as you could possibly get in the SEC any given year. They get South Carolina, Bama, and A&M at home. You do want to go on road trips to Auburn, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, but all of those are capable. All of those are doable games that you can absolutely win. If Bo Perebla can put it together early in the season, this Missouri team could be really dangerous. Love the addition of Ahmad Hardy. I think Kevin Coleman's going to be a great piece on the outside. They have the guys to make this happen. I think it's a team that, as long as they can get a couple of those wins, maybe 2 out of 3 from the South Carolina, Bama, A&M, maybe even 1 out of 3 out of those games, they could very well be a playoff team, be in kind of that right under the SEC championship, but firmly in the playoff situation like a Tennessee was a year ago. Then you do have a Texas Tech team over in the Big 12. This schedule sets up very nicely. It's even in Big 12 standards, very, very manageable. You do have some road trips that are going to be tough, and you're going to have to find at least one win among at Utah, at Arizona State, and at Kansas State. You got to find a win there. If you can go 1-2, I think you're in a really good position to make the Big 12 championship. You do have Oregon State in the non-con, which is a little bit of an interesting matchup. I think they should be able to handle business there, but as we know about the Big 12, it's probably going to be a two-loss team against a two-loss team in the conference championship. As long as Texas Tech can get one of those wins against Utah, Arizona State, or Kansas State on the road, I think there's going to be a team that's going to be in the Big 12 title contention and then maybe just playing for a spot in the CFP. So Texas Tech, very talented team, did a lot in the offseason to kind of up their ability, up their talent level, and I think it's setting up very nicely with a schedule that is very kind to them. And then over in the ACC, North Carolina, this would be the story of the year. There's no doubt about that. When you talk about Bill Belichick coming in, I think a lot of people want to see this team make somewhat of a CFP run. If they get that win, a week 1 win against TCU, which I think is a relatively tall order with Josh Hoover and a lot of guys returning for the Horned Frogs, but at the end of the day, you have the ability to do some special things. You do have Clemson at home. Road trips to UCF and South Carolina, or not South Carolina, and Syracuse are massive spots for this team, but if Gio Lopez can put it together early, you can lose that Clemson game and still be firmly in the conversation for an ACC title game. And if you get there at 11-1 with only one loss to Clemson, you're probably in the CFP. Now, a very tall order. I'm not necessarily picking that to happen for North Carolina, but when you look at that schedule, it's about as favorable as you're going to find in the entirety of the Power Four. And it's a coach that he can put together a defense. Gio Lopez can score some points, and it would be really interesting to watch that unfold. There's no doubt about that. And then why not Indiana again over in the Big Ten? Obviously, the schedule is pretty similar to a year ago. They don't get Ohio State, but they do have trips to Oregon and Penn State, so a little bit less of a margin for error. There's no doubt about it. In this year, might need to win one of those games. Maybe you could go 10-2 depending on what happens elsewhere in other conferences, but as I see it, this is probably the team to circle again in the Big Ten with Fernando Mendoza coming in. Michael Kamara is about as good as you're going to find on the defensive line across the country. They have the dudes. They absolutely can make this happen, and there's some other teams there, whether you want to talk about Washington. Illinois' schedule sets up pretty nicely. Penn State's is actually relatively doable, but Penn State doesn't fit into this category, obviously. But at the end of the day, I think Indiana could be this year's Indiana. So we'll see what happens there. Obviously, Curt Cignetti has those boys rolling, and we'll see what happens for Indiana this upcoming season. But there's going to be one of these teams. There's going to be an Indiana that finds their way in because maybe a favorable schedule while them just handling business the way that they're supposed to. So going to be interesting to watch that develop. Those are the 4 teams that I'm circling. But as we move forward here, who's falling in the SEC? Who is the team that is going to fall on their face? Because there's going to be one. Well, there's going to be probably about 3 of them that actually fall on their face this upcoming year because you look at the SEC, whether it's Texas or Georgia or Bama or LSU, those 4 teams seem to lead the way. They all think they can win a national title this year. South Carolina, Tennessee, A&M, all of them think they can make the playoff this year. You add in Oklahoma, Auburn, all of those teams think they can possibly do something special as well. There's not enough wins to go around. There's going to be someone that falls on their face in an 8-4, 7-5 fashion that you're looking at right now and saying that's probably a 10-win team. Now, could that be a Bama team that struggled after a tough 2023? I'd be a little bit surprised with the level of defense that they play, but still very much on the table. Texas with Arch Manning working out, another scenario where I think the defense plays at a high enough level to give them a very high floor, but at the end of the day, you never really know how all of that really rolls itself out. And with some more injuries on the offensive line, things get a lot more sketchy in a hurry for the Longhorns. And then Georgia has a couple more questions than usual, a little bit lesser known of a team. I still think they're incredibly talented, obviously, but definitely some questions there. Could any of those teams fall on their face? Now, the way that I see this in the SEC is you could really break it down into kind of 2 different groups of how this season could go down for the SEC. Those top 4 teams, Georgia, Alabama, LSU, and Texas, those are the teams that, in my opinion, and really everyone's opinion, have kind of separated from the pack, at least in the preseason as we head into the year. Those 4 teams could separate. They could all be 10-2, 11-1 at the end of the year, and then you just see a ton of 8-4, 7-5, maybe 5-7, 6-6 teams that are comfortably behind those 4 teams. You could also see a Tennessee get a win over Georgia, and then South Carolina gets a win over Alabama but doesn't have a great season. A&M beats Texas at the end of the year after losing 4 games earlier in the year. You have a Texas team that loses to Ohio State to start the year and then has to walk a tightrope the rest of the way in the SEC and loses a couple of games here and there. The way that I look at this thing is you're going to have a lot of 10-2. You're going to have a lot of 9-3 in this conference, the same way you had a year ago, and it made things really complicated, especially when not everyone's playing everyone else. You don't really know who's better than another team. You don't really know from last year. I feel confident that Texas was better than Ole Miss, but never got to see them on the field. Ole Miss beat a Georgia team that beat Texas on the road, so it's a very, very complicated conference. I don't think it's going to get any easier to get an idea of what this conference is, but the reality is one of these teams, one of these top 6-7 teams is going to go 7-5. They're going to have a season that is remarkably forgettable. I think Tennessee and South Carolina might be the 2 teams that if you put a gun to my head, I had to pick one, those would probably be the 2 teams that I would circle the most aggressively, but the reality is there is going to be a team that is maybe not even a bad team by any means, but a 7-5 record could turn into 10-2 really quickly, and vice versa in the SEC this upcoming season. So whether it's LSU that falls on their face, or Texas, or Alabama, or Georgia, or just everyone right below them, it's going to be a weird conference, and someone in that conference is going to walk away very upset. And I think there's going to be quite a few fired coaches at the end of the year in this conference, especially in this conference when you look at some of the names that are on quite the hot seat heading into this year. But this is going to happen at some point throughout the year. Who it's going to be is your guess is as good as mine as of right now. We'll get to my predictions next week. I don't feel great about this conference as a whole, but at the end of the day, I do think there's got to be one that falls on their face, and we'll figure out who that is in about 26 days or so here. How will week 1 impact the CFP conversation is a really interesting one to me. It's something that Josh Pate was talking about on his show, has talked about quite a bit, and it's going to be a huge talking point. All the way into week 15, week 14, when they fully decide the field, you have a Texas-Ohio State matchup that will define the SEC Big Ten debate this year. There's no doubt about that. Clemson, LSU will do the same exact thing with the ACC and SEC. And then you have a couple more. You have Bama, Florida State. You have Syracuse, Tennessee. You have South Carolina, Virginia Tech. all of those, if the SEC totally sweeps those 4-0, you can bet that the ACC is only going to get one team in that thing. And a 9-3 SEC team could outweigh the loser of the ACC championship the way that it didn't a year ago. And then for Texas, Ohio State, I think both those teams can absolutely rebound from this loss one way or the other. I don't think it's going to be a burying loss by any means, but I think if you get to the end of the year and let's say it's Penn State against Ohio State in the title, it's LSU against Texas in the title for the SEC, you're in a position where, let's say Penn State and LSU win, it might come down to who won that week one game depending on who's going to be the 1 or the 2 in that scenario. So let's say Texas wins week one but then loses to LSU. LSU will probably outweigh a Penn State team that beat Ohio State. So it's all kind of mental gymnastics. It's all a little bit ridiculous, but it will factor in. There's no doubt about that, especially if, Texas goes into Columbus and wins by 10 or wins by 14. Then you're in a position where the SEC is going to get a little bit of a lean throughout the rest of the season over the Big Ten, and then I think vice versa if Ohio State wins by 14 and Texas goes down. So that's going to be a really interesting conversation. Week one is littered with huge games, and they're littered with cross-conference games that will define the CFP conversation. How much they should define them is a big-time talking point, and we can get into that as the season rolls on, but this week one is going to be hugely impactful all the way into week 15 when they're putting together the bracket. Then you got to talk about who's on the hottest seat, and it's always a tough reality to talk about in this sport. You'll find the SEC has quite a few names that didn't get fired last year that very well could have, that now go into this year that just need to win. And I think Billy Napier leads off that list. I don't know what the record has to be, especially against that schedule. I have no earthly idea if he has to win 9 games, if 8-4 is enough with a win over Georgia maybe would be enough to keep him around. I tend to believe that would be enough, but you don't really know what he needs to do. And then you go around the rest of the conference, Brent Venables on very rickety footing over there in Oklahoma. If he has a bad year, especially with John Mateer and Ben Arbuckle coming in, I think they might clean house. As big as that a buyout is, I think they might be forced to. Then Sam Pittman, absolutely in trouble at Arkansas. I think that is one where unless Arkansas can put something really special together, I would be surprised if Sam Pittman was the coach in 2026. Love Sam Pittman, love his energy, but just don't think they're going to be able to put it together this year. Freeze at Auburn, same exact situation. Now, he has the ability to possibly put it together with the talent at wide receiver, with Jackson Arnold coming in as a talented quarterback at the very least. Maybe not the perfect quarterback by any means, but absolutely a guy that can elevate that play a little bit for you. Maybe he can find his way out of that, but that's another sketchy situation down there in Auburn. And then obviously Brian Kelly. I don't think he's getting fired. I think the buyout is too big. I think LSU is in a precarious situation in terms of finances as of right now. Not a bad situation, but at the very least, not in a we're going to spend $60 million to get this guy to walk out the door type situation. So I think Brian Kelly is safe. Now, if the bottom falls out and they go 6-6, you can bet he's not safe in a hurry. So we'll figure that out as the season goes on. But a lot of these guys have big-time games pretty early on in the season. Florida has Miami. Florida has a couple of big-time games that if they don't win, things are going to get really loud in a hurry around Billy Napier, especially if DJ Lagway is not healthy. And then Lincoln Riley over in the Big Ten, another one I don't think the situation will allow itself to have him be fired. I think the situation over there at USC is we have a lot of money tied up in this program. We have a lot of money tied up in this coaching staff. I think it's going to be really tough to fire Lincoln Riley. Obviously, if the bottom falls out, much like LSU, things could be a little bit different. Maybe they just do a swap of coaches at the end of the year. Who knows? But Lincoln Riley actually ends up at LSU the way that it was being talked about before he took the USC job. But at the end of the day, a lot of those guys, some of those guys, I think in Sam Pittman, Hugh Freeze, if they don't deliver, they're absolutely gone. There's no question. Billy Napier in that list as well. And then you have the Brent Venables, the Brian Kelly, the Lincoln Riley that are just in a little bit different situations. I don't know what the mark has to be, but I know that the buyout is very hefty, and a couple of those schools just might not quite have the ability to pull that off right now. And then you got to talk about retirement. These guys aren't getting fired by any stretch of the imagination, but Mike Gundy's put it on the walls that this is probably his last year in college football. Kyle Whittingham, I feel pretty confident that Morgan Scalley will take over as the head coach at Utah after this upcoming year. You have Kirk Ferentz, that is probably pretty tired of the way that college football is going right now and has been doing a great job over there at Iowa for a long time. He might hang him up, and then you never really know. With how crazy this sport is, how much they ask of the coaches, and how it's not really getting better even when they put in new rules, you could very well see some very good coaches leave the sport after this year. I'd be a little bit surprised if it happened this quickly, but over the next couple of years, if things aren't figured out, you could see some massive names leave this sport, and obviously you don't want that to happen, but it's going to be a really telling year for how the coaches feel about college football right now. Sticking in the SEC, as we talked about the hot seat, can the SEC get back on top of the sport? That's what a lot of people are wondering. Obviously, some of the SEC fans will tell you they only care about their team getting on top of the sport, not the SEC. I would fall into that category, but at the end of the day, I do think this is a conversation to be had, and the way that I see it is kind of the way that I saw it last year, if I'm being totally honest. The SEC to me has more teams that are national title good. I think you have 4 teams for sure in Texas, Georgia, Alabama, LSU. Those are national title good teams. And then I think you could throw another team in there, maybe a South Carolina, maybe an A&M, maybe a Tennessee. I'd be a little bit surprised if they won the title, but I think you have very solidly 4 teams that can win the national title that are national title good in the SEC. In the Big Ten, I think you have 3. I think you have Oregon, Penn State, and Ohio State. I think it's fair to say those 3 options might be better than the 4 options in the SEC just because of the path that they're going to take, because of the overall ability on those teams, and because they have a little bit more, at least over the last 2 years, a little bit more confidence in a couple of those teams than you would over in the SEC. So Penn State, Ohio State, and Oregon, they're incredibly likely to at least factor into the title conversation. I talked about me not being as high on Oregon as some other people, but at the end of the day, they will play a role in the national title conversation. I think any number of those teams in the SEC could just not play a role in the national title conversation. Now, I think those top 4 are very likely to, but LSU could fall off the face of the earth. Alabama could fall off the face of the earth. Texas could have more injuries and things just kind of tumble for them. So there's an ability for some of those teams to totally fall out. I don't think Georgia's going to be one of those teams. I think they will factor in one way or the other. But at the end of the day, I haven't decided who I think is going to win the national title. I don't feel confident when I will decide it. I think next week is when I'm going to do all my predictions. Just go Monday through Friday, break down a new conference every day, break down the playoff on Friday, do all of that good stuff this upcoming week. But the fun part about it is Clemson could just ruin the party for both these conferences, for both the Big Ten and the SEC, get a big-time national title win. I know Dabo was talking about going 16-0 a couple of days ago. They have the capability of doing that. They would have to beat LSU in week 1, but they can do that and then definitely run the table in the ACC, and we'll see what happens in the playoff. But as of right now, I think the SEC has about 4 teams that can really do this thing, maybe 5, depending on the way you look at it. But I think the Big Ten might have 3 of the best 4 or 5 options in the entire country when you talk about Oregon, Penn State, and Ohio State. So that's going to be really fun to watch, no doubt about it. Obviously will be a topic of conversation that will get annoying pretty quickly. I can almost promise you that. If Texas loses by 14 to Ohio State, it's going to get really loud and really frustrating in a hurry for some SEC fans. But finally, could this be 2007 2.0? This is the question that I feel like we're going to be asking every single year for the rest of time, especially in this expanded playoff, because so many crazy things have the capability of happening in this 12-team playoff or 16-team or 64-team, whatever they come up with next. At the end of the day, what will we need to happen? We need a big-time upset, like an App State over a Michigan or an NIU over a Notre Dame last year. We also need a Group of 5 team to take over the world like USF did back in 2007. Maybe a Tulane gets 2 wins over maybe Duke and who do they start their season with? Northwestern and Duke, and then they're sitting at 11-1 at the end of the year as a top 10 team pretty firmly. You have a couple other ones, and then I think you got to have at least 10 college football playoff spots that are totally unspoken for going into the final week of the season. It's a relatively tall task. I think last year you probably felt pretty confident that no matter what happened, Texas, Oregon, Ohio State, and Penn State were going to be in the field. Even if Penn State lost that game, I think they were playing Minnesota at the end of the year, they were going to be in the field at some point, in some way. Ohio State did lose the last game of the season, they were in the field. Oregon did not matter, they were undefeated, they were going to be in the field even if they lost to Washington. Texas, same thing with Texas A&M. They wouldn't have been the SEC championship, but feel pretty confident they would have been one of the at-large bids. So it's definitely going to be a tall task to only have two teams that have totally locked up their spot in the CFP. But when you look around this sport right now, I can't find the separation. Now, once you get around number 8 or number 9 in the country, I feel like there's a little bit of a gap there, but that's quite a big group at the very top of this sport that could win the national title or could fall off the face of the earth. So it's going to be awesome to watch this season unfold. I don't think 2007 is replicable, if I'm being totally honest, especially with the aggressive lean to teams that have the resources, that have the money. That's always been the case in the sport. It might be more the case now, and I think it's going to be a little bit harder for some of these teams to break through the way USF did in 2007, or even the way Oklahoma State did in 2007. So we're in a position where it's going to be really hard to make that happen. I also think there's just too many teams that can separate. There's no teams that have, in my mind, but between Penn State, Ohio State, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, LSU, Oregon, a couple of those teams are going to separate as the quote-unquote best teams in the country. How much they separate by will be something to watch, but a couple of those teams are at the very least going to be the teams that everyone's circling at the end of the year as the national title favorites, whether that's Texas and Oregon or Texas and Penn State or Texas and Ohio State or not Texas at all. There's a lot of different things there, but I don't think we're going to get a 2007 2.0. I think we're going to get an awesome season. And I think that's going to be the case for just about every expanded playoff season because there's a lot to play for pretty much deep into the season. Obviously, there are some downgrades to that, but there are definitely some great things to play for in some intense games down the stretch, including maybe a Georgia Tech-Georgia game that means the world for both those teams as they try to get into the playoff. And that's actually what we'll talk about next. We'll talk about teams that could make their CFP debut, like a Georgia Tech in 2025, and I have kind of a ranking here. They're not really ranked. It's really just 10 teams that stand out to me as teams that could make it happen. But I have 10 teams right after this, so stick with us.